Hi, Sam.
Hey Bob, good to
Uh,
be with you. Nice to see you again.
yeah, it's been literally days since we last saw each other, but
It has.
but that was
But Frank Fukuyama is something else. I think I read somewhere that Freud said if he ever were to meet his maker, he would ask him for a better brain. Maybe he was thinking of Frank's.
yeah. Well, I should explain that I last saw you after I had a public conversation with Frank Fukuyama here at Union Theological Seminary, where I am. You were in attendance, and you were also in attendance at a dinner afterwards, at which you demonstrated your considerable knowledge of American intellectual history and American politics, which is one thing we're going to talk about today. But I should tell people who you are first, just in case.
Okay.
There may be a few who don't know.
I'm still trying to figure it out.
Yeah, you occasionally probably go in public without people recognizing you, right? There are a few people out there who don't.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Yeah, it happens that you go to a shopping mall and are not mobbed. That happens to me sometimes.
I inhabit a very small niche, far smaller than yours.
I wouldn't go that far, Sam. Anyway, for those who don't know you, or in fact would know you if they heard your last name, which they haven't yet, if they're listening on podcast as opposed to watching on the watching the video on our site, you are Sam Tanenhaus, and I'm Robert Wright, by the way. This is The Wright Show. But you are, well, first of all, until fairly recently, you were the editor of the New York Times Book Review, but you've also written books yourself. Your biography of Whittaker Chambers was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, in fact. You wrote a book more recently called The Death of Conservatism, and you're working on a book on William F. Buckley. And all of this
It's the life of conservatism.
yeah, this is it's a prequel. So all of this suggests that you have some understanding of conservative politics in America, which is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the very interesting things going on in the Republican presidential race, and try to put them in the context of conservative history and conservative politics. Why don't we start with a kind of a background question? And this comes from a book review you wrote just last week, I think, for the Times Book Review. I just want to read the first part of the first sentence. Whenever we're in danger of forgetting that the modern Republican Party is captive to a movement, one new excitement or another will jolt us back to reality. And then you go on elaborating. You hear this a lot. He or she is a movement conservative and so on. What do you mean? What is the movement, and what does it mean to say that the Republican Party is captive to it?
Well, and some would dispute the adjective captive, but the modern Republican Party has been divided against itself for a really long time, and it's one reason there has been such dynamism and volatility in it. If you go back to the beginnings of what I'll call the beginnings of the modern era, after World War II, there was an expectation on the American right and among Republicans, including leading Republican figures like Robert Taft and John Bricker, the two senators from Ohio, Midwestern Republicans, that there would be two orders of business. One would be to roll back the socialist predations of the New Deal, and the other would be to rebuild or kind of unbuild America as an imperial power and make it more an independent, what we sometimes call Fortress America, isolationist country, in the epithet everybody uses. Though isolationist, I think people like Rand Paul say, has become more of an epithet than a description. Mm-hmm. So that was the expectation. What happened was the first president in that era, the first Republican elected since 1928, 1952, Dwight Eisenhower, was a moderate, and in effect institutionalized both the New Deal and the American internationalist profile. And that's when the war began. And it never really went away. That's not to say all conservatives now, all members of the conservative movement are isolationists. What they became instead was unilateralists. The term actually invented facetiously in the modern era by Richard Hofstadter and Richard Rovere and Arthur Schlesinger in a book they wrote on Douglas MacArthur, who is one of the early heroes of this movement. So the idea is that within the Republican Party, there is an ideologically impassioned group of voters, of leaders, statesmen, supporters, business people who think the Republican Party essentially betrayed them. Mm-hmm. Ever since, there's been a war between that group and the so-called party establishment, and we're seeing it again today. It happens in almost every election cycle. There were a few breakthroughs along the way. The most important, and it's the reason he is the Mount Rushmore figure in the American right, was Ronald Reagan, because Reagan came out of that movement.
Can I take you back a little bit? I mean, first there's Goldwater, right? I assume he's a conspicuous manifestation of this desire to take back the Republican Party.
It began with Douglas MacArthur and Joe McCarthy. Uh-huh. Then there were figures nobody remembers anymore except for people like me and Rick Perlstein. And some writers on the right, like Justin Raimondo, has written very well about some of the more extreme figures on the right. People like Bracken Lee, the governor of Utah, and T. Coleman Andrews and Clarence Mannion. They're forgotten names, but extremely important people. They were, in effect, defectors from the Eisenhower Republican. Okay. Goldwater was the first breakthrough because he actually won the Republican nomination. Mm-hmm. Not to the primary system we think of today, because there were far fewer primaries back then. Goldwater really won through a brilliantly managed backstage campaign of delegate hunting and counting. But Goldwater was the breakthrough. And with Goldwater, the power in the party seemed to shift from the Northeast, right? You know, the Herald Tribune, which was a newspaper, the Nelson Rockefeller, Thomas Dewey Republican Party, Eisenhower Party, shifted to the Sun Belt, where new populations were. And the essay you mentioned is about a very good new book that describes the roots of American conservatism in Dallas. Well, as that
this is your book review is about that book.
That's right. Yes, mm-hmm. Not country. An unfortunate title for a quite fine book. Mm-hmm. Young scholar, I think his name is Edward Miller, shows you how a lot of what we think of today as the kind of radical right took root in Texas among former Democrats as other strains of dissidents fed into the anti-New Dealism and anti-internationalism, specifically integration. Mm-hmm. The Brown decision. So
Brown versus Board, which desegregated the schools, and I think at roughly that time, of course, slightly after the Goldwater election, but Lyndon Johnson observed that the whole civil rights thing, the Civil Rights Act in particular, was going to lose the South for the Democrats. The South had been Democratic since Reconstruction, and that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. The whole civil rights thing, desegregation, and so on.
Yes, because what that did was to revive the states' rights argument. And not to get too much into the weeds, but like a very good writer like Mike Lind pointed out years ago that Goldwater's campaign in 1964, the states he won mirrored the ones that Strom Thurmond won as a states' rights party candidate in 1948, with the addition of Arizona for Goldwater. It was similar to the states George Wallace won as a breakaway Democrat in 1968. These strains have been there for a really long time. We're seeing them again. Mm-hmm. Something I would add about the civil rights the changeover, is that few remember it now because it was a watered-down bill. But the first modern civil rights legislation was actually passed in 1957. And it was pushed through by the Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson. And it was a weak bill. Many compromises along the way because he had to appease the Southern Democrats, the Dixiecrats, who would filibuster and kill the bill. Mm. Not one Republican in the Senate voted against that civil rights bill. That shows you how that was before the movement had taken over. And partly what the movement did was to pull in those Southern legislators. Mm-hmm. Strom Thurmond was the most conspicuous example when he became a Goldwater supporter. Pull them in and turn them into Republicans.
And I should add, I misspoke if I suggested that the civil rights legislation was after Goldwater, because it was passed after Kennedy's assassination, but before the election, the 64 election, I guess, right? So
passed, I believe, in July.
Yeah.
You can go back and see in the reporting of the period, including the New York Times, where Everett Dirksen, a quite conservative senator, leader of the conservative wing of the party from Illinois, denounced Barry Goldwater for opposing this massive civil rights legislation. It was a real dividing line. And I think an important thing, Bob, I want to bring this up because I do think some of the characterizations are unfair and distorted. And also ahistorical. I think it's a mistake to think they're all racists. That may well be true for some sectors of the Republican Party and the conservative movement. But it's important to remember, too, when it made its bigger breakthrough, which came with Reagan in 1980, and prior to that, in his remarkable insurgent nomination campaign in 1976, when he almost defeated the unelected incumbent Gerald Ford, there were a lot of people in the North who did not consider themselves and didn't necessarily comport themselves as racists, who were anxious about social disruptions in the society. Mm-hmm. And so I just think it's important to weigh that, because there's a tendency to paint everyone with a fairly broad brush. And one of the things I try to do and like to think occasionally I manage to do is to say, well, the story is a little more complicated than you might think.
Okay. Now, one more thing I'd like to clarify before we say anything else about Reagan. When you mentioned the backlash against Eisenhower's internationalism and said it can be aptly called unilateralism, I assume, as that's played out, if you go all the way up to George W. Bush being called a unilateralist, I assume that doesn't always mean unilateralist to the extent of opposing involvement in NATO, or did it mean even that early on? What it came to mean with George W. Bush is you go it alone if necessary. You'd like to have allies. You're certainly not particularly amenable to letting the United Nations constrain your action, for example, the Security Council. But it's more like on a continuum between pure unilateralism and woolly-minded one-worldism, and you're pretty close to the unilateral spectrum. But sure, allies are great, including NATO sometimes. That's what that end of the spectrum of argument has kind of come to mean, right? Neocons aren't averse to having allies if they'll help you bomb stuff. So
No. Of course not. You're absolutely right. And I'm really glad you used the word continuum, mm-hmm. because it drives people crazy. It muddies and muddles the picture. But all of these points of view exist on a continuum. But yes, what unilateralism originally meant actually was opposition to NATO, to the Marshall Plan, and the United Nations. And it's interesting, if you really go back to the mid-50s, a period that fascinates me now, you will see there was a whole strain of protégés of Douglas MacArthur who said, we can solve our international problem, our global communist problem, very easily. No more foreign aid. Why are we spending millions on these socialist countries? And that's something Bill Buckley and the National Review people agreed with. All we need to do is build a powerful air force, and we can bomb everyone into submission. And it's interesting because that argument did carry over. The war by airstrike or even by drone is really a continuation of that argument. But it became very controversial in the 50s because it became an argument that originated within the Strategic Air Command. People like Curtis LeMay, Edwin Walker, the crazy general who was John Bircher that Kennedy fired. These figures were saying we can win the Cold War on the cheap. We can do it with B-52 bombers. And what that also meant was we can do it. Why are we letting socialists in London and in Paris tell us what to do? Why are we submitting to the dictators, the one world dictators in the United Nations? There really was a lot of that. And over time, it modulated so that by the late 1960s, William Buckley would write in the New York Times Magazine, at the height of the Vietnam War, he would say, well, there are these antiquarians who believe in rolling back or liberating the communist world. That had become discarded. My sense, my belief, and I've written about this in a couple of places, is that what George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, what that group did after 9/11 was actually to revive the Goldwater period rollback doctrine. Rollback was the answer to containment or the counter argument to containment. George Kennan's containment argument that came out of the late 1940s when Truman was president was, let's pen the Soviets in. And James Burnham, who was the great political strategist for the other side, for the hard anti-communists, said, and people like Walter Lippmann agreed with him, that argument doesn't work. And Burnham's answer, which would never have been Lippmann's, was, let's roll it back. Let's be aggressive. Well, if you look at George W. Bush's famous West Point speech, I think in June 2002 or something, before Iraq, he said, we will take the fight to the enemy. We won't let them call the shots. That's exactly what Goldwater said as early as 1960 in his book, Conscience of a Conservative. So these strains run all the way through our politics, and that's good news and bad news. Okay. If you're a liberal, it's good news and bad news. The good news is none of this stuff is really new, and none of it is quite as extreme as you think. Because it does get filtered into the argument. There's that great thing in the Remembrance of Things Past where Proust says, as soon as you have a discussion with somebody, you're conceding something. It's when you refuse to acknowledge the other person that you don't have a debate. Okay, so that's the good news. The bad news is it's not going away. Whether it's going to be ISIS or 9/11 or some other trauma, there will always be the person or the movement or the spokesman, the writer, the pundit, the politician who says, let's get our own. Here we are, America, and we have become this muscle-bound colossus, and we don't need to be. We can make things right again. Okay.
Now, before we jump up to the current moment and Donald Trump and so on, just one a stop in the Reagan era. I gather that when I interrupted you a few minutes ago, you were about to say that it's with Reagan that the movement really asserts itself and kind of takes control. Now, of course, a couple things. I mean, by that time, a force I don't think you've mentioned so far, but evangelical Christians had become kind of a prominent part of what we now call the base. And the other thing is that Reagan, of course, wound up not rolling back the New Deal. And on foreign policy, it's, I guess, kind of a mixed bag. I mean, he did call the Soviet Union the evil empire and certainly, I guess, wasn't eager to be constrained by the United Nations. On the other hand, by the end of his term, he and Mikhail Gorbachev were like, singing Kumbaya together as they vow to rid the world of nuclear weapons.
Well, politics works.
Yeah.
Reagan is a fascinating figure because he started on what today, although it wasn't at its time, would be called the left. He was a Hollywood labor union guy and never really impassioned about it, but he went along with it. He was part of the crowd. Then in the 1940s, he turned right, as many did, was still a kind of, I think, 1948, he was a kind of anti-communist liberal. He was a Harry Truman Democrat. Then went further to the right. And by the early 1960s, he was very close to a John Birch Society, Liberty League, Liberty Lobby type, hard right wing. Mm-hmm. And moderated that yet again. Now, that's what politicians do. And he was very good at it. But Reagan had been a product of the New Deal, and he admired Franklin Roosevelt. His war was against the Great Society. And if you look at some of Reagan's speeches, there's one he gave, I think, at the Press Club in Washington in 1966. He says, look, no one questions the humane and honorable intentions of the Great Society. We all understand we want to make the world a better place. This isn't the way to do it. And of course, then he go off and give another speech that says, today it's Medicare and tomorrow it's the gulag, this kind of thing. But there was a modulation in it all. And because he came out of the left, he understood like the basic humanitarian impulses behind it, utterly disappeared today. But the thing with Reagan, the more I think about it, is what he did that was so difficult, and you're right, Goldwater got there to some extent too, was to normalize the movement and really to bring it in to the establishment, not to mount a kind of, Henry IV, Bolingbroke insurrection against it. It was actually to bring it in. They were essentially country club kinds of guys. Mm-hmm. Yes, they responded to the passions of the right, but they also believed in the party. Goldwater was a tremendous party man. For 5 years, he was the head of the Senate re-election campaign committee. He would travel around state to state supporting Republicans and boasted he knew more Republicans than anyone else in America. Imagine Ted Cruz saying something like that. Reagan, too, issued his famous 11th commandment, right? Thou shalt not speak ill of another Republican, unless it was Gerald Ford, whom he hated. So they were inside guys who pulled the movement into closer to the mainstream. It kind of polished the rough edges. So by the time Reagan ran in 1988, he who had opposed Medicare, opposed Social Security, opposed benefits for veterans, reversed himself in all those things. And no one ever accused him of being a flip-flopper or a turncoat. And here's the last thing I'm going to say, and then you can actually speak. So much of this is about rhetoric. Mm-hmm. It's about the language you use. If you take the policies, the ISIS policies of a Cruz or a Rubio, how different in the end would they be from what Obama is doing? Reagan's rollback ended up being almost identical to Truman's containment. No, the difference is the rhetoric. And we talked about this tonight. Bill Buckley had a great aphorism. Rhetoric precedes action. The words somehow matter more. So what does Ted Cruz accuse Obama of? Mm-hmm. He's not calling them radical Islamists. Instead, he says they're whatever else they are. He won't use the word. Or Marco Rubio says, we've got to admit it's a clash of civilizations, right? The old Bernard Lewis, Sam Huntington, Iraq thing all over again. It's all talk. And the only one, as far as I know, who actually wants to do something militarily aggressive is Lindsey Graham, who's like one notch above me in the nomination contest, and I'm not winning yet. Talk, and that's okay. Better talk than actual bombs dropping.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, what Cruz says he'll carpet bomb, Donald Trump says he'll bomb the shit out of him. Well, first of all, you can't even technically do carpet bombing anymore because now we use smart bombs, and carpet bombs, the bombs you use in carpet bombing are dumb. And then secondly, well, what does bomb the shit out of them mean? Presumably they would do something that seemed like a little bit of acceleration so that they could say they were true to the word. But you're right, it's all incredibly kind of vague. Now, here...
A lot of politics is talk, So, yes, they might – well, and also what they would say is we're doing this. America is going to solve this. We're not going to wait to let other people tell us what to do. A fascinating thing, I'm sure you've noticed this, is how the American right is now in the grips of this kind of, this frisson of Francophilia, Prize after 9/11, and now Hollande, of all people, has become the new Douglas MacArthur because of that horrible attack in Paris, and it shows you how there's an odd desperation to some of this. The Republican Party is doing very well in many ways, as we know. They're great on the local level, at the state and local level. They're really good at grassroots local politics and deserve enormous credit for that. I admire this in the Tea Party, by the way. No one talks about the Tea Party anymore. They kind of brought grassroots activism back to party politics. And the last gasp, before the parties themselves became utterly discredited. I mean, there's never been a period, I don't think, where Republicans in particular have had so little use for party politics. They don't like their own leaders, even the people they elect. It's interesting. It's a kind of nihilism or anomie.
Okay, that's a good segue to Trump, I think, because his rise is popularly attributed, I think, to a couple of things that might seem a little ephemeral. I mean, they're things of the moment. One is, as you said, the disenchantment with traditional political leaders, political figures. I think the first thing Trump did that really started to win hearts and minds was just say such impolitic stuff that you concluded he must not be a regular politician. This is not a guy who came out here with talking points, market-tested stuff, because he's saying stuff that would seem crazy things for a politician to say. So there's the disenchantment with politicians. And then secondly, there's the whole issue with the war on terror and the accelerated fear of terrorism owing to Paris and then San Bernardino, and a corresponding antagonism toward, well, certainly what they would call radical Muslims, but in some cases toward Muslims more broadly. And so you can see Trump, on the one hand, tapping into these things that are kind of issues on the moment. But from your perspective, I'm sure there's a historical background to this. I mean, you're thinking in terms of like what strands is he picking up on in conservative history. So my question to you is, does the kind of coalition you might see a Trump assembling, what does that bear a correspondence to in the past? I mean, is this movement conservatism fairly straightforwardly? We didn't talk about nativism per se and whether that's been traditionally part of movement conservatism, but that's another thing that Trump picked up on, which I failed to mention, is the whole immigration issue, which is not unrelated to his stance toward Muslims, of course. Is something, I mean, in terms of what part of human psychology you're appealing to on those two issues. There's there's a certain kind of unity there, I think. So what does this look like in historical perspective to you?
Well, I mean, all the things you said, Bob, I think are pieces of it. That plus his tremendous skills. And I think we're all kind of coming around to that. This is someone with a real political talent, and because he has that sixth sense feel for where the argument goes, the way Bill Clinton did. Bill Clinton would always be a step ahead of his critics in the media, liberal media, I'm thinking, because he would be on to some issue right before the rest of us got there. And I think Trump is good at that too. There are different competing strands in Trump because he doesn't seem to be a constitutionally preoccupied movement conservative. This is what threw off his within the intelligentsia, the intellectuals on the right. They didn't understand how Trump could I think Rich Lowry and Ramesh Ponnuru said this in quite an interesting analysis of him in the fall. He never uses the word liberty. He doesn't talk about freedom. He doesn't talk about the Constitution. No, that moment has ended. That was the Tea Party moment that has ended, where it was about abstract principles. Now it's more the cult of personality. And Trump is very good at that. So that's one strand of it. The nativism you mentioned, yes, we can see lots of earlier strands. You can go back to a Dixiecrat like Thurmond, and then a later Dixiecrat, 20 years later in 68, George Wallace. And yes, there is a kind of nativist fear. What's really good about Trump is he says it in this kind of genial, unexcited way. Now, he's capable of anger, but he is fortunate. It's a gift that he has a kind of impassivity when he says a lot of these things. Something else I would add, it takes you back. It's one element I'm going to throw in because I don't think it's mentioned enough. I think there's a kind of misapprehension among many observers and normal folk, and that's who most of us observers are, about a candor versus accuracy or truth. We don't understand why Trump can make outrageous claims that are then painstakingly discredited. Thousands of Arabs or Muslims in New Jersey celebrating after 9/11, and why it is he gets away with it. Okay, this ties into his appeal to people who feel constrained or intimidated or even censored by political correctness. When you look at the polls, people don't say, I like Donald Trump because he knows the truth and speaks it. What they say is, I like Donald Trump because he says what he thinks. And and as amateur psychologists, not like you who really knows this stuff, I would say, I just kind of sense that when many people, especially older people, commit what are now called microaggressions, they mean well. They have no idea they're offending somebody when they say, wow, you came from Mumbai and now you're at Princeton? They don't mean to offend when they say that. They're impressed by it. But that carries all these associations. And before you know it, one can find oneself labeled insensitive or far worse. And I think a lot of people who hear Trump blurt these things out and don't sense any animus coming from him. It doesn't sound as if he hates these people. He's just saying what he thinks, okay? They think, well, yeah, that's what I do too, and what's wrong with that? They don't mean anything ill by it, okay? Another thing not looked at enough with Trump is his television program. My wife and I, used to watch it some. If you see him in the boardroom, in The Apprentice, and somebody gets fired, they do the post-mortem. How come your team lost and the other one won? What does he talk about? You offended your teammates. You wouldn't listen to the people around you. They had good ideas. You thought you knew everything. That can almost seem a model of statesmanship or politics. And remember, in 2004 or 5, that was, I believe, the second most watched program in America. That is where his constituency begins. And those people think, those viewers, that maybe they know Donald Trump and he's not the bad guy that ideological, Ivy League educated conservatives are saying about him, or that biased liberals are saying about him. So that gives him a kind of authenticity. And we're back to that other so big, in the late 60s and early 70s, right? Authenticity was the most important thing. And Lionel Trilling wrote this, magnificent book, series of lectures, Sincerity and Authenticity, how true feeling changed into the presentation of being true to yourself and all these things. And Trump kind of fits into that. The political argument itself is the dissident one. The great Richard Hofstadter said as long ago as 1954, the dynamic of dissent in American politics is on the right. And Trump has that dynamism in his dissent. There is that establishment out there that's not answering the question or solving the problem. One guy can come in and kind of shake it up. And that one guy is oddly very much like yourself. I'm reading a fascinating piece, actually a 2-part article that I was put onto by this excellent little book, Nut Country, by the great Teddy White. After Teddy White had been famous China correspondent, and before he wrote the famous campaign books, The Making of the President, 1960, and thereafter, he was kind of a freelance journalist writing all over the place. Sorry. And he wrote a 2-part essay, for The Reporter, great old liberal magazine, on Texas, called The Texas Land of Wealth and Fear. And some of the people he quotes in it are super rich oil guys. the Hunts are the most famous. H.L. Hunt was actually, said to be the richest man in the world. But there were others too, who were very conservative business guys from Texas. And when you hear them talk about politics, it sounds a little bit like Trump. I may do something on this. One of them, I think his name was Cullen, says, Eisenhower's not a bad guy. He's a swell guy. It's just he's listening to the wrong people. He's got to get rid of this Dewey and some of these other guys, and start listening to Joe McCarthy. That's the guy who really knows what's going on here. And he says it in this kind of earnest / patronizing way that makes me think that Trump is actually the heir to someone like that. Because remember what Trump has been saying recently. He said, hey, look, I supported McCain in 2008. I supported Mitt Romney in 2012. They couldn't do it, so I'll do it now. That sounds a lot like these Texas guys. They really thought they had the answers and they had the money to make a difference. H.L. Hunt actually was a kind of combination of Rupert Murdoch and the Koch brothers. He created a media empire, magazines, radio, circulating books. This was the 50s. Wasn't TV yet. And then these others sound more like our big donors today, but who say in the background. Trump is like the big donor who's come forward, except I actually think he's kind of a cheapskate and won't pay for any of this stuff. Let me add one more thing. The real button, the hot button Trump has pushed, and this goes back to our earlier discussion, came in the very first debate, and he was prodded into it. He was asked, the very first question in the very first Fox debate was, would any of you run on a third party if you don't get nominated? And Trump's hand went up. Then he withdrew it, he retracted it, and now he's come back to it again. Wright, in those brilliant essays from 1954, had a phrase that he called this movement, he called it Texanism, the unrecognized third party in America. And he lists its preoccupations: hatred of the UN, convinced that there are communist subversives in government, opposed to ending Jim Crow. All of these things that point to the evils of a beltway that's been captured by liberals, by liberal nationalists. Trump has not worked through the ideology in that way, but he gets that when you make the third party challenge or threat, you're dividing the Republican Party against itself. No one ever says, or at least I haven't heard anyone say, wow, we have a third party that's really bad for the Democrats. It wasn't bad for the Democrats in 1992. Perot did not hurt Clinton, even if I think Clinton would have won anyway. But Perot may have denied him a majority, but the one he took down was George H.W. Bush, who got a smaller percentage of the vote in 1992 than Herbert Hoover got in 1932. That finished off, or seemed to. That was really the end of the conservative movement as the engine of the party, by the way. It all ended in 1992. Remember, without the help of the Supreme Court, we have a run of Democratic presidents that would start in 1992 and carry up through 2012. Mm-hmm. That's a long run. That is as long a run as Franklin Roosevelt and Truman had. Now, there are other things going on. The country's polarized in different ways. The politics have become localized. Nonetheless, on the national presidential level, we have a Republican Party that's been marginalized for a really long time. Trump's third party threat is the one that could actually undo it in some way. So they're going to have to figure that out. It begins in alienation from the Republican Party. And oddly enough, the Freedom Caucus, or earlier called the Tea Party Caucus, all those insurgencies within the Beltway actually hurt rather than helped the party. Not simply because of the dysfunction that happened, but it created a kind of Samuel Beckett-like endgame that Republicans can never win because they can obstruct endlessly, but they can't go beyond that. There's always a threat of the veto. Frank Fukuyama has coined this fantastic term, the vetocracy that we live in. We've created the government of the minority and the supermajority. That one of the other rules. It's crazy. Well, that actually damages the movement because the movement has nothing to show for it. So Mitch McConnell can say, we have opposed Obama every step of the way. And then the right will say, you're an appeaser and collaborator with Obama. And it's a circle they can't get out of.
Let me push back a little on the question of whether Trump is crazy or crazy like a fox. I agree with you that the conventional wisdom has shifted toward crazy like a fox. There's a couple of data points that I think are still at odds with that interpretation. I mean, look, obviously he's not a total idiot, but and there must be something good about his instincts. But on the side of the interpretation that, to some extent, what happened is just that his reflexive, that he's benefiting from a kind of the way his just reflexive candor and cantankerousness kind of meshes with the current moment. I mean, that was kind of the original interpretation, I think. And I think there are a couple of things that remain, data points that remain on that side of the argument. One is this strange incident where he was making fun of a reporter with a disability. Have you seen that video?
Yeah.
Because it is amazing.
Serge Kovalevsky at the Times. Yeah.
Oh, so you know him?
Oh, well, I certainly, he was not someone I ever worked with. I worked with a lot of people at times because I did several different things there. But everybody knew who he was. I mean, it was
So it's amazing to me. I mean, that's a moment like, you got to see the video to appreciate how much this is like a kid in sixth grade making fun of somebody and, calling them a spastic or whatever the language would have been. And how even in sixth grade, most of the kids in the class would probably consider that in bad taste. And like right now, you've just got to think, who did he win over with that? I cannot believe that there's anyone who he didn't already have in his. I mean, if I grant you that there are a few people who maybe are so fed up with political correctness that they like making fun of people with disabilities, even if I grant you that there are a few of those, surely they were already part of his, he had already won them over. And it's true, of course, that this hasn't hurt him in the polls. On the other hand, I don't think many people have seen the video, and it wouldn't shock me if this became part of an attack ad. Because I really believe, look, my faith in the American public is ebbing as a result of some things that are going on now. But I've got to believe that with a lot of Republican voters, that would not sit well. So that's a case where he really just seems to me to have been going on gut instinct in a way that wasn't helpful. Then there's another data point where I suppose you can argue it either way, but it's this case where he was speaking to, I forget what Jewish organization it was, but where he says, hey, I'm like you people. I'm a good negotiator, right? And
the Republican Jewish coalition.
Okay, so that's a conservative Jewish audience. And I guess the interpretation, my first instinct is is perhaps misguidedly to judge him as if he were an ordinary politician and go, whoa, wait a second, man, you just antagonized your audience. Now, I suppose you could argue that that's more in the crazy like a fox category, either in the sense that, hey, that's a politically incorrect thing, and there are a lot of voters out there who are fed up with political correctness. Or you could even argue that it's a dog whistle to anti-Semites in the extreme case, because, Trump does occupy this interesting position with regard to, in the extreme case, Aryan nationalism, right? I mean, there are things he's saying that appeal to a kind of an ugly part of the American populace, and I think a pretty small part. But so you can argue that one maybe either way. I'm curious as what your interpretation of that was. But in particular, when he made fun of that reporter, I just don't get that as being in any sense smart.
Well, I'd say no. I quite agree. I don't think you win fans with that. But I think you've hit on two things here. First of all, you've used the word voters, and not to sound like Charles Krauthammer going on Fox. nobody has voted yet. We're looking at polls. And I have a feeling, I was just talking about this with my wife last night. We were discussing this. I have a feeling a lot of several Republican campaigns now are looking very closely at 2004 and Iowa, when Howard Dean seemed to be steamrolling the field, and John Kerry just dismantled him in Iowa. That there was a difference between the excitement of the public presentation and casting the ballot, going to the caucus, lining up behind one delegate or another. For instance, we know one thing with Trump, and you're a data guy, so you're probably far better versed in this than I am, that in online polls he does better than in kind of traditional telephone polls. That if just like the old mistake that used to happen when conservative and in some cases racist candidates would do much better than anyone expected, because some people who were voting for them would not admit they were. All right. So with Trump, we really don't know how many people aren't just saying they like him versus the number who will actually vote for him. The second thing is, yes, there's a ceiling. Our politics is so fragmented, so fractured. The party, again, the Republican Party, is so divided against itself that, and Ross Douthat's been saying this from the beginning, there is a natural ceiling to where Trump goes. Trump making like really objectionable, offensive, childish bullying remarks about Serge Kovaleski, and my former colleague at the Times, is not going to bring him more votes. It's also not going to cost him a lot of votes in a certain area, because they're going to say, all right, so Trump gets carried away and he says this thing. What, suddenly he's Adolf Hitler now? And it's playing off the media. One of Trump's innovations, by the way, is playing off the conservative media. He's the first to really do that, which is interesting because if you follow the more libertarian ideological right, the Ron Paul, Rand Paul group with the Liberty group, right? You see, they don't like Fox. They have their own video hero, a guy named Ben Swan, who's more of you probably know, more libertarian guy. What's the guy's name? Alex Jones in Austin, Texas. The conspiratorial view. Okay, to them, the conservative media, the Fox media, has become the new establishment. This is where liberals and conservatives, never connect. John Podhoretz has this thing where he says, I can talk liberal, but you can't talk conservative. Well, very few of us can talk libertarian, and it's a very different argument. That's why it looked like Rand Paul would do well, and then suddenly evanesced, in part because the foreign policy debate turned, and he wasn't really ready for prime time and for other reasons. But Trump is really good at contesting what now feels a bit like a fossilized conservative establishment. So he sets himself off in this different place. And I think, and the reason I mention this is people who are attracted to him don't say, thank God we finally got a Friedrich Hayek, right winger here. We finally have an ideologically pure person. So they will, because they're not looking at him that way. I bet you they like him all the more for having given money to the Clintons, for having praised Obama. Because I have a feeling, again, amateur psychologist, a number of people on the right, maybe not a lot of them, but a number of them would say, well, gosh, I really wanted Obama to be a great president too. I had a lot of hope, that he really would change things, until I found out 5 minutes after he entered the Oval Office that he's really just a socialist who was born in Kenya. I really wanted him to be great. I would love it if the Democrats were really Americans and not handmaidens of the jihad, this kind of thing. So I think Trump's language, his command of a certain kind of rhetoric serves him very well. And people will say, all right, so we said that really stupid thing about the reporter. And you could come up with 100 extenuations for that. He's mad. They come after him all the time. They're saying things about him that are untrue. Let me add one more piece to this. And here I'm aim and probably fail to reach the target of serious political argument, which is that one of the distinctions we're seeing in our politics now, not within the Republican Party, but between the two parties, Democrats versus Republicans, is when you hear the whole business about why won't Obama call them by their real name, why won't he say they're radical Muslims, why won't he admit that these are Muslims, radical or not, who are doing all these things, all the rest. That in some way derives from this kind of Leo Strauss idea of the value-based politics. What kind of people are we? What does it mean to be an American, right? What is our identity? And you could, that argument comes out of that, and it filters down lower and sort of the ecosystem, where you get down to the silt. And that came in back in the McCarthy period when Joe McCarthy would say, Wheeling, West Virginia, there are 200 communists in the State Department. And then people would fact check and say, well, Joe, it's not 200. I mean, and he said, well, okay, I meant 100. Well, Joe, we're not coming up with the numbers here. And then it's 87. Right? And each time he is being Pinocchioed in our current parlance or approach. Well, 1952, when he was at the peak of his fame, because he began in 1950 with his attack on the Truman administration, and Republicans mistakenly thought it would all end with the election of Eisenhower in 52, and it didn't happen. But he was a big speaker at the 52 Republican convention. And Joe McCarthy said, one communist is one communist too many. One communist in the State Department is one communist too many. And conservative, including conservative intellectuals, loved it. And what was their argument? Here you are counting heads. Do we really need to know how many communist beings are in the government? Isn't the fact that this is a problem where it all begins? So now you come forward. You come forward to Trump saying, there are mobs, there are swarms of them in New Jersey applauding. And then, after 9/11, cheering it on. And people say, well, no, there weren't. We don't see that there were thousands. And then if you look at Breitbart, they'll say, we've got proof that Trump was right. That there was a newscaster, Pablo Guzman or something, who went on the news and said, well, there might be 8 guys in an apartment building who actually supported it. They say Trump is right. He used, and Guzman, whoever the reporter was, if it's not him, I apologize, used the word swarm. So Trump spoke the truth. That, I think, in the broadest sense, is a kind of value politics. So you say, look, Trump at least will say we have got a problem, a serious problem with Muslims. And let's admit it. As Leon Wieseltier said many years ago, and he was saying it in that elegant, ironic way of his. He's saying, okay, nobody wants to tar all Muslims by any means. He says, but it wasn't Episcopalians who did it either. 9/11. So it's a little bit of that argument. And I think what I'm saying is that one could be a sophisticated, thoughtful person and say, about Trump, as people said about Joe McCarthy, all right, he's not always right on the facts. He goes too far, right? He calls people names. He says somebody's a communist when they're not. He may even have cost somebody a job. There may be a school teacher out there who even commits suicide or something because of a falsehood Joe McCarthy made, that committed. But you know what? At least he knows there's a problem. At least he's trying to do something. And if the rest of Washington would only admit it too, maybe we could get somewhere. And I think there is something of that with Trump. And it is not to endorse it or, I always fear when I do these things that I'm dignifying stuff. And I think that's why some people get mad, of the 8 people who read what I write, 4 get mad on either side. And because the conservatives think I'm being condescending and patronizing. I'm trying to explain them rather than just recognize what they're about. I'm trying to understand them rather than simply recognize the truths they're speaking. And liberals think I'm taking them too seriously and trying to dignify them. So, I don't want to be guilty of any of those things, but just try to figure it out. And I do think in some ways you can create a balance sheet if you're a Trump person. Say, all right, we kind of wish he hadn't said the thing about surge at the time. So we don't like that one, but there's the other stuff too. You know?
Okay, so kind of final question. You know, we started out talking about the movement, and you know, Trump, I guess, picks up on some of what you would call the movement. I mean, his foreign policy declarations, although probably not all that coherent, have a kind of a unilateral, hey, we'll do whatever the hell we want feeling to them. On the other hand, in domestic politics, he's a long way from saying, let's roll back the New Deal, and if anything, is appealing a little bit to the left in some of the things he's saying about income inequality and so on. He is trying to pick up what became part of the movement, the evangelical vote, and I guess to some extent succeeding, but all told, you know, he's something other than a traditional movement conservative as they've come to be known. So, like, how would you? What is he? What is there a way to kind of coherently characterize what would be his constituency if he wound up winning the election?
Wow, what a great question. What does it mean to be like a Trumpian?
Yeah.
You know, and you make me realize, Bob, the problem with so much of what and I mean, your excuse, you write about much more serious and important things, but people like myself who write about politics and even in the historical context and all the, and, you know, intellectual history and what have you, is we don't look enough at voters. And what is it that a voter might think he or she is getting when they vote for Trump? It really could come down to the simplest idea of a kind of leadership. And if you follow the Buckley principle that you start with rhetoric, here's a guy who seems to offer, again, this from the perspective of someone who might vote for Trump, at least one thing we're not getting from anybody else, which is utter candor, without fear. And without fear, then that becomes something bigger. Somebody who will do what needs to be done. Now, does he know what needs to be done? I think most people figure, you know what? He's a smart guy. He knows people. He's always saying that. You know, I'm going to give you terrific health care. I'm going to find a health care guy that's better than anyone you've ever had. So it may be a very simple appeal of leadership. Now, in the most negative way or most alarmed way, that feels like the cult of personality, and it feels like the brown shirts. In the other, it could be almost a kind of a more generalized populism. Say one last thing about this, because I do not have a good answer to your question, but I can throw out, you know, what you call data points. There's a fascinating piece that the brilliant Richard Goodwin, you know, who was the Kennedy guy and Doris Goodwin's husband, Kennedy era and briefly LBJ advisor, wrote in the New Yorker in 1969. It was January 1969. It was when Nixon was about to take office after that horrifically painful, tragic political election of 1968. As bad as we think things are now, remember in 1968, there were two political assassinations, Dr. King and Robert Kennedy, and there were riots in both cities where there were national conventions, right? We know this in Miami and Chicago. Younger people may not know, but there it is. And so Goodwin wrote a piece in the New Yorker, a very long essay. And one of the points he made was that some voters who had initially been attracted to Robert Kennedy, who was the populist, charismatic, anti-establishment figure in the Democratic Party, apparently ended up voting for George Wallace, who was the reactionary maverick in the other party. Well, in his own party. Actually, they both came out of the Democratic Party, but one on the far left, one on the far right. What connected them was a kind of populism and an ability to touch the individual voter, to cut through all this other stuff. And in theory, let's look at I've never heard anybody say this, so I'm going to say. If you look at some of Trump's policies as you've just said, he likes the way they do healthcare in Canada and Scotland. He likes the thing we really need, which is a single-payer medical coverage. I mean, the reason we're going bankrupt is because of all of that. He likes that. He's very proud of his relationship with African Americans, whether they're deserved or not. He really thinks they're great. He's not baiting them. His economic views are, as you said, complicated because he sees himself, even though he's really a brander and a salesman, he sees himself as a producer in the old, Rockefeller Carnegie vein. So he doesn't like Wall Street a whole lot. You say, you know what? You calm down the rhetoric and you get a decent cabinet around him, and he does know a ton of Democrats as well as Republicans. Maybe you'd actually get a somewhat plausible presidency. Now, nobody hold me to that, please. I'm just trying to do a thought experiment here.
Yeah, if we had more time, I think I would take issue with. I mean, what I would say is I guess that he has said things and done things that I find so abhorrent, just in terms of what part of human nature he's appealing to, that I just don't want to see that guy as president, regardless of the fact that, most people who seem as if they would be horrible presidents turn out being not quite that bad by virtue of the institutional constraints and so on. But it's just, I just think, particularly now, which I consider in some ways a perilous time in world history and American history, you just have to draw the line and say, and say, this is such an unhealthy contribution to discourse to start casually talking about establishing databases on ethnic groups, or when somebody says to you, hey, we have a problem in this country, it's called American Muslims, you just nod your head and smile rather than saying, no, let's be clear. I just have zero tolerance for that kind of thing. Which isn't a judgment on actually what you technically said, which is that he might wind up being competent in the realm of governance, and even in some ways, not conservative. All that could be true, but I have standards.
I'm afraid I don't.
Okay, well, then I guess we'll leave it there. Well, thanks so much for providing, first of all the historical context, and all the contemporary analysis as well. People can read your stuff in the New York Times. You are a writer at large in the New York Times. We can
no longer. Oh, that was a position I left. So I write a column, monthly column for Prospect, British magazine on politics. I write for both Bloomberg Politics and Bloomberg View. And I'm working on my biography of William F. Buckley Jr. And, you'll see my stuff in one place.
Okay, so we can read your stuff in Prospect and Bloomberg View. Eagerly await your Buckley biography. And the Whittaker Chambers biography is timeless and and very highly regarded, so we can encourage people to take a look at that.
Well, it's very kind of you, Bob.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Sam.
My pleasure. It was really fun.
Okay, take care.
You too. Goodbye.